In this video, I want to start transitioning towards thinking again about assertion. Because an obvious question at this point is, well, that's all very interesting to see that there's this KK principle and that maybe it's not a good principle, maybe it is a good principle, but we just saw an argument that it isn't. But what relevance does this have for anything we've been talking about up till now? And what I want to first show you, I'm going to draw out elements of the Hawthorne and Magador discussion, but in a different order from the way that they talk about it, is that there actually is a relationship between the KK principle and some of the stuff we've been talking about with Stalnaker. And the relationship is basically that if you think that things like the KK principle fail, then there will be cases where something is presupposed or it's common ground, but we don't know that. We don't know that it's common ground. That's a kind of weird thing to say. So let's break that down carefully and see why that would be a consequence of allowing things like KK to fail. So I'm going to follow Hawthorne and Magador here in first assuming a sort of overly simplified version of the common ground. We'll come to Stalnaker's actual view shortly, but it's easier to see the overall point by starting with a simpler case. So the overly simple view we're going to assume is that something is common ground if it's mutually known. That is, if it's known by everybody in the conversation. What we can now see is that if that is what common ground is, and it's also true that the KK principle fails, that sometimes you know P without knowing that you know it, then you can actually get cases where a proposition is common ground, but it's not common ground that it's common ground. Or to put it slightly differently, there are cases where we actually don't know exactly what the common ground is. Because suppose that we both know some proposition, like the proposition that it's raining. Also, both of us don't know that we know that proposition. So here it's mutual knowledge that it's raining, because we said we both know that it's raining, so it's part of the common ground. But we all know that's on this view that something is part of the common ground just in case it's mutually known. So for us to know what's in the common ground, we have to know what's mutually known. But if I don't know, for instance, what I myself know, then I can't know what's mutually known. If I don't know that I myself know it's raining, then I can't know that it's mutually known to be raining, because if it were mutually known to be raining, that would entail that I know it's raining. That's just the definition of mutual knowledge. So in fact, if KK fails, we can actually be in situations where we don't know what the common ground is on this definition. There will be cases where we all know some proposition, say that it's raining, and we all know that something is in the common ground, just in case it's mutually known. But if we don't know the facts about our own knowledge, then we also won't know the facts about mutual knowledge. And if the facts about mutual knowledge are exactly the same as the facts about what common ground is, then it's just going to follow that we don't know the facts about what's common ground. So in that example where we both know that it's raining, but we don't know that we know that, it's common ground that it's raining, but we don't know that it's common ground that it's raining. So what that means is, from the point of view of each of the people in the conversation, there are two different ways the common ground could look. Maybe the common ground includes the proposition that it's raining, or maybe it doesn't. We don't actually know. So that is a kind of weird consequence of thinking that KK fails. You might have thought you always know what the common ground of the conversation is. And what we've seen is that actually, on the simplified view, depends on a particular epistemological assumption. It depends upon the KK assumption. Because if KK fails, then we can't say that we always know what the common ground is, because whenever it fails, as you can see, we're just going to get cases where we don't know what the common ground is. Now, as we all know, the Hawthorne and Magador simplification really is a simplification of Stalnaker's view. Stalnaker doesn't think that the common ground is what's mutually known. Rather, he thinks about it in terms of this attitude of presupposition. In fact, you might put it in terms of mutual presupposition. He says that a proposition is in the common ground just in case it's mutually presupposed, just in case everybody presupposes it. But what Hawthorne and Magador point out is that actually the same kind of point maybe applies to presupposition as well as knowledge. It also applies to a view that takes the common ground in terms of presupposition rather than knowledge. So just as we talked about the KK principle, we might also think about what we might call the PP principle, which says that if you presuppose something, then you presuppose that you're presupposing it. And just as we asked whether the KK principle holds, we can also ask, does the PP principle hold? Is it the case that when you presuppose something, you're also presupposing that you're presupposing it. And Hawthorne and Magador point out that just as you can run a margin for error argument against the KK principle, it looks like you could also run a margin for error principle against the PP principle. If you thought the margin for error argument against KK was good, you could also run an analogous argument against the PP principle. Because think about the margin for error principle stated in terms of presupposition. That would say that, for instance, if Magoo presupposes the tree is not 1 inch tall, then it isn't 2 inches tall. And the same kind of reasoning that favored the margin for error principle in the case of knowledge, it looks pretty good for presupposition as well, you might think. Because the margin for error principle is motivated by the thought that in order to know something, you must be able to rule out that it holds in close cases. You can't both know something and it be true in nearby cases. And you might think that holds for presupposition as well when people are being rational. You might think to rationally presuppose something, it cannot be that there are nearby cases in which the thing you're presupposing is false. For instance, you might think that to presuppose that your ticket is going to lose the lottery, it cannot be that there are close cases in which it fails to lose the lottery, i.e. you win the lottery. So Hawthorne and Magador think the margin for error principle is just as plausible for presupposition as it is for knowledge. But of course, once you grant that, you now have an argument against the PP principle. I won't go through it, but it goes exactly the same as the one for Mr. Magoo with knowledge did. You just replace knowledge with presupposition throughout. So it looks like we could maybe give the same argument against the PP principle as we did against the KK principle. And once we do that, then you can see that the kind of structure that arose on the simple view of common ground arises on Stalnaker's actual view. So on Stalnaker's actual view, something is common ground, just in case everybody's presupposing it. And if the PP principle fails, we can see that there are going to be cases where propositions are common ground, but it's not common ground that they're common ground. For all the common ground says, something other than the actual common ground could be the common ground. And the situation would be something like, well, everybody presupposes that it's raining, but they're not all presupposing that they're all presupposing it, precisely because the PP principle is failing. In such a situation like that, then for all their presupposing, it could be that they fail to be presupposing that it's raining. Now again, it looks like we want to say that everybody's aware on this view of what it takes to be common ground. They know that something is in the common ground just in case it's mutually presupposed. But that means that if they don't know what their presuppositions are, then they also don't know what's in the common ground. So if I don't know that it's being mutually presupposed that it's raining, I don't know that it's raining is part of the common ground. And really, when I'm saying I don't know this, this is really just a sort of a loose way of talking about our presuppositions. So if we don't presuppose that we're all presupposing it's raining, then we can't be presupposing it's part of the common ground. Or put somewhat more precisely, if their presuppositions don't settle what their own presuppositions are, then their presuppositions won't settle what the common ground is. So it'll be presupposed that something is in the common ground just in case everybody is presupposing it. But since our presuppositions actually leave open what we're actually presupposing, they thereby also leave open what's part of the common ground. For all our presuppositions, given all that our presuppositions say, there are multiple possibilities for what the common ground might be. But of course, if our presuppositions together leave open what the common ground is, and common ground just is mutual presupposition, that's just another way of saying that the common ground itself leaves open what the common ground is. The common ground doesn't include the information of exactly what the common ground is. So that is the first part of the connection between these epistemological questions about principles like the KK principle and what we've been talking about when we talked about assertion. Because we introduced this idea of the common ground, we saw that Stalnaker actually defines it in terms of presupposition. You might have thought that it's always, what is taken for granted is itself always something that's taken for granted. We always, in some sense, know what's in the common ground. But what we can now see is that that assumption actually depends on things like the KK and the PP principle. If you think the KK principle is false, or you think the PP principle is false, then you're going to be forced to say that sometimes something is common ground, even though the common ground itself doesn't know that that information is part of the common ground. That's a sort of maybe a kind of weird idea to get your head around, but it is just something that follows if we reject these principles of KK and PP. So that's the first step. We've shown that these principles have consequences for what the common ground says about itself. In the next few videos, we're going to see that it actually causes further problems for Stalnaker in his treatment of the uniformity principle and diagonalization.